Metal had watched Sonic run down buildings before, though never in person. It was from the dim basement where Eggman stalked all his endless footage of Sonic. Metal had watched all those tapes obsessively, scanning each one multiple times and studying Sonic's every move. It was on those yellowed archival tapes that Metal had seen how Sonic could avoid the fall by running down a building. So Metal was neither surprised nor afraid as Sonic held him and ran down the empty elevator shaft. Though it was nearly dark, a series of safety lights provided minor illumination. Each bulb set in a plastic casing, and they zipped by in rapid succession, the yellow lights blinking away like the distant lights of an airplane. Nearing the floor, Sonic jumped and landed at the bottom. Once he was secure himself, he carefully placed Metal on his feet and turned to stretch his arms in the air. Based on Sonic's speed, Metal calculated they must be at least several hundred meters underground, and ahead there stood a single, steel door. It was utterly utilitarian and built to stop the elements, but nothing more. Countless leaves had drifted along the threshold and grown into tiny piles. Metal reasoned they must be what the egg pond was meant to clean. "I do not know what lies on the other side. Are you ready?" Metal said as he turned to Sonic. Please," Sonic shook his head. "I've been drowned, gassed, turned into a robot, and made to drink chemicals. What could possibly be worse than that?" "Let us hope we do not find the answer to that question," Metal said. He pushed the door open, and the leaves rushed inwards. They drifted up into the wind and flowed into the corridor beyond. Whatever lay ahead, it was too dark to see, but just as Metal was activating his headlight, a light flashed overhead. Another flashed further down, followed by another. Each light turned on further and further down the tunnel until it was distance, not darkness, that limited his vision. He stepped into the tunnel of pure concrete. Although it was far from spacious, it wasn't oppressively narrow either, for the tunnel's circumference was at least a few meters. Through the center, a great, steel-wrapped pipe stretched endlessly into the distance, with countless wires popping in and out, while a cold mist covered the floor. Metal examined the pipe and the walls, scanning left and right for a microphone, camera, or any other surveillance equipment. To his great surprise, he found nothing. They appeared to be entirely unsupervised, but there was no sense in taking unnecessary risks, so Metal crept silently down the hall, with Sonic following closely behind. The pipe never ended. It kept going and going, and Metal figured they had walked at least a full kilometer until the monotony finally broke. Metal saw it first. A large panel, littered with buttons, stood just ahead on the front of the pipe. It looked like a control panel, and above it, a blank monitor hung on the wall. Walking up to it, he ran his fingers across the control panel, and immediately sprang backwards as he felt a small jolt in his fingertips. The screen above lit up, and the machine began to buzz. It was a horrible sound, one that plagued the depths of his memory bank. It was the sound of the magnet room. The memory flashed through his processors. It was as if he could feel himself stuck to the wall again, helpless against the electromagnetic current ravaging his hard drive. The only reason he survived last time was his spare drive, but he couldn't rely on it again. This time he would lose all his memories, all his data, and without that, he may as well be dead. He stumbled backwards, grabbing the first thing he felt, and closed his fingers tightly around it. He clicked off his optics, preparing himself for the worst, but the buzzing wasn't growing louder. It merely hung at a low tone. He felt something squeeze his hand, and he looked back. In his haste, he had grabbed Sonic's hand. For this part, Sonic merely shrugged, though his face concealed a small smile. "I thought... the magnet," Metal murmured and pulled his hand back. "Never mind. This device clearly utilizes some kind of electromagnet, although it is not nearly as powerful as the one we found before." "Why do you think that is?" Sonic said. "Between the control panel and the monitor, I believe this is some sort of detector. It must be measuring whatever is in this pipe, and it is using a fairly strong electromagnet to do so." Metal looked at the screen above. Now that the device was active, a stream of data blurred across it. "Given the enormous size and deep underground location, as well as the magnet, I think this must be a particle accelerator." Sonic stared at him. "A what?" "A particle accelerator. Scientists use it to make new discoveries in physics," Metal said. "Using a series of magnets, this device speeds up hydrogen nuclei to near light speed and smashes them together. The extreme speed gives the particles enormous energy, and because mass is energy, their collision can sometimes create particles no one has ever seen before." "But why would Nega have one?" "I am not sure. We need to investigate further." Metal turned backward. Just ahead, a shabby office door plastered the tunnel wall. Metal nodded to Sonic, and they crept toward it. Once they arrived, he placed his hand over the doorknob and slowly turned it open. Inside, a light switch stood to his left, and he flicked it. A weak bulb flashed overhead, revealing a remarkably mundane office. A cheap particle board table stood in the center, and next to it leaned a chipped filing cabinet. Metal walked up to it and ran his fingers over the cabinet drawers. He discovered they were unlocked, so he pulled them open. Dozens of binders and folders cramped the inside, and he picked one up. He leafed through the paper, each page brimmed with complex mathematical equations and figures, the likes of which he had never seen before. "What'd it say?" Sonic said. He was peering over Metal's shoulder, and he was so close Metal could feel his breath as he spoke. "I'm not sure I fully understand. This is incredibly complex. It takes days, maybe even weeks for me to understand this. The research in this paper is intense, and it appears Nega has derived a fully new system of mathematics to test his theory." Metal looked up from the paper. "Nevertheless, I understand the research on a basic level. It involves the very nature of reality itself." Sonic said nothing, so Metal continued. "The universe is complex and often very strange, but the rules that govern its behavior are actually quite simple. You can think of the universe as a board game with 3 pieces and 4 rules." Metal gestured to the room around them. "For example, consider this room. What is it made out of?" Sonic scrunched his face in thought. "Wait, don't tell me, I know this. Everything is made out of molecules." "That is true, but what are molecules made out of?" Sonic stared blankly, then shrugged. "Molecules are made from atoms, and atoms are made from protons, neutrons, and electrons. Electrons are elementary particles. They cannot be broken any smaller, but protons and neutrons can be broken into quarks." He held up 2 fingers. "Thus, we have 2 of the 3 game pieces. Leptons, which include particles like electrons and quarks, those 2 make up all matter in the universe. As for things that are not matter..." Metal gestured at the fluorescent bulb above. "We have a family of particles called bosons. Light is not matter, so the photon is a boson. That is all you need to create most everything you can see, but of course, a game with no rules would be boring, because nothing would ever happen. That is also true for the universe. Leptons, quarks, and bosons can interact in 4 different ways, and we call each of those interactions a force." Metal pointed at Sonic's robotic leg. "For example, what force is your leg harness?" "I remember what you told me. It's electromagnetism." "That is correct. The electromagnetic force is perhaps the most obvious of the 4. It binds atoms together into molecules, and serves as the foundation of all electronic devices. And if you will recall Nega's fusion reactor, it harnessed the power of 2 more forces, the strong and weak nuclear force. The strong force binds quarks into protons and neutrons, while the weak force transforms the different types of quarks into one another. That leaves the last of the 4 forces. It is the weakest force, and the most poorly understood." "Wait, I got this," Sonic said as he held up his hand. "All this stuff has totally stupid names, so I bet the 4th force is even worse. It's probably called the extra weak force, and it turns up into down." "Close, but it is the weak nuclear force that turns up into down. The 4th force is trillions and trillions of times weaker than the weak force. We call this force..." Metal looked up from the pages. "Gravity." Sonic stared up for a moment, but when Metal said nothing else, he threw his hands up. "Gravity? You're telling me it's plain as day that the medium-hot force keeps all the quarks bound together, but no one knows why we don't just float away into space?" "That is correct," Metal continued without any hesitation. "This theory is called the Standard Model of Physics. It gives us the 3 fundamental particles, quarks, leptons, and bosons, and the 4 forces, electromagnetism, the strong force, the weak force, and gravity. I know it may seem strange, but it is all well understood. All except gravity, which no one can explain. Scientists have spent decades trying to properly place gravity in the Standard Model, and no one has ever solved it. That is, until now." Metal flipped through the pages. 3 particles and 4 forces. There were 7 pieces to the Standard Model. Now tell me, what else is mysterious and comes in 7? Sonic's eyes widened. "The Chaos Emeralds." "Nega seems to think so," Metal said. He pulled a page from the folder and held it up so both he and Sonic could examine it. Scribbled on the page were pictures of the 7 Chaos Emeralds, each one carefully filled in with a different color: silver, red, cyan, purple, blue, yellow, and green. And below each color was a different piece of the Standard Model: quarks, leptons, bosons, the weak force, the strong force, electromagnetism, and gravity. You see here? Metal pointed to the yellow emerald. It says electromagnetism. The yellow Chaos Emerald controls the electromagnetic force. Remember the Chaos Drive that we snapped just after roboticizing your leg? Sonic gasped. It was yellow. People have harnessed the Chaos Emeralds before, but never on the subatomic level, and no one has ever unified gravity into the standard model. And yet, according to these notes, Nega has. If he can harness the Chaos Emeralds and control each piece of the standard model. Metal closed the notes and looked Sonic directly in his eyes. It would give him complete control over every aspect of reality itself. Sonic opened his mouth to speak, but the rapid sound of pressurized gas cut off his voice. A dark streak burst through the mist, and Metal saw it just in time to drag Sonic to the side of the tunnel. He shoved the notes into his crate and watched the shadow turn back. It flung forward, and as it reared into the light, Metal saw the gleaming, metallic frame of E2048. Oh my, what horrendous manners! I can't even turn my back on you for a single minute! However did you two find your way here? Nega's voice cracked over E2048's radio. Metal held perfectly still and leaned to whisper in Sonic's ear. How did he know we were here? I checked for hidden cameras everywhere. What's the matter, Sonic? Nega laughed over the radio. Did you lose your voice when you lost your leg? I bet you're as slow as ever with that scrap of metal slowing you down. Sonic threw his head up in response. Ha! You wish! I'm as fast as ever, with or without my metal leg. When I said scrap of metal, I didn't mean your leg, Nega said. Now catch me if you can, rodent. Although, I'm sure you won't. Sonic, be careful! Metal hissed, although Sonic never heard it, because Nega's laughter exploded to fill every inch of the tunnel, and E2048's engine revved into a roar. Sonic leapt up, charging forward to strike, but E2048 flew backwards just as his spines tore into the air. Sonic sailed ahead, stomped his feet on the ground, and quickly turned back to face his opponent. But E2048 paid him no mind. Instead, it turned around and fled through the office door and back into the tunnel. Sonic growled, then leapt forward in pursuit. All Metal could do was run, but the fight was moving away from him. He charged out the door himself, though the distance between him and the other combatants was growing far faster than he could run. Wait, come back! Metal shouted. Sonic must not have heard him, because he leapt again with his magnetic foot outstretched. He obviously hoped to stun E2048 as he had done before, but this time, E2048 was prepared. Its arm flashed forward just as Sonic's foot would have hit its optics. Sonic uselessly clicked the magnet in his foot, hoping to gain enough traction, but his foot slipped off and he fell. Before he could hit the ground, E2048 thrust forward and clenched his claws around him. Sonic struggled, kicking his feet and clicking the magnet on and off, then froze with horror as he saw the reason his magnetic foot was useless. E2048 had plastic claws. I've got you! Nega's voice boomed from the radio. Now, let's be off. You're of no use to me here. Metal had to remain calm, for although Sonic was in terrible trouble, panic would be of no use. His engine might be broken, and his pace slow, but Nega was making the same mistake he had always had. He was ignoring Metal, and this time, Metal would use it to his advantage. Come on, Nega. If you're gonna take me somewhere, you can at least be a good host and tell me where, Sonic said. Sonic hadn't given up struggling, though it was proving increasingly useless. Metal continued to run. If only he had his engine, he could save Sonic in no time, but E2048 was moving away, carrying Sonic faster than he could run. And yet, Metal had his plan. He reached into his crate, pulled out the bottle of sodium hydroxide, and with a great heave, he threw it. Although he had aimed it for E2048's plastic arm, it missed, instead splattering across E2048's optical screen. E2048 sputtered, unable to see, and unable to clear the liquid from its face with Sonic in its claw. Its engines hissed, and it blindly launched upward, hitting the ceiling and plummeting to the floor. Metal ran. He was nearly to his friend's side. He would rip Sonic from E2048's claws, and Sonic would lift him into his arms, and they would both be free. What the... how tedious, Nega said over the radio. Metal kept running. He was only a few meters away, but Nega didn't stop. Listen, Paperweight, stop, just for a minute. I have a deal that might interest you, but I'm only going to say this once, so pay attention. Metal skidded to a halt in front of E2048. The steam from its engine misted the surface of his optical screen, and he wiped the condensation away with his hand. Nega, what do you want? Why have you captured me and Sonic? Metal said. See, that's just it. Sonic was the only one I was after. You, my dear little copy tin can, just tagged along. When E2048 tried to warp away with my dear Hedgehog, you came along by mistake. Metal said nothing. He had suspected as much. Through their entire adventure, Nega had only really talked to Sonic. Metal was but a useless copy to him, and Nega would have no use for him. But why? Why the maze? I know you've been toying with us, Nega, and I demand you explain yourself, Metal said. Is it really so hard to figure out? You two did put on a good show. Metal clenched his fists, but Nega continued to laugh. So, Paperweight, here's the deal. I don't need you here, and as fun as this has been, you've outgrown your role as my toy. Truth be told, you've become a bit of a nuisance, and I really don't want you here. But I am a reasonable man, and I think we can come to an agreement. If you'll only hear me out. I don't want you here, and you don't want to be here. So how about you just leave? Skedaddle, go home. Don't come back. Metal heard Nega click something over the radio. Instantly, the air in front of him ripped apart, and sunlight burst through. Metal felt wind blow through the air, and he heard the chirping of birds. There, through a mysterious hole in the air, shone the autumn forest he had left so long ago. Metal hesitated. There was freedom, and all he had to do was walk. Oh, right, nearly forgot. We can't have you leaving empty-handed. My silly counterpart told you to get the Chaos Emerald, didn't he? Metal heard that strange click again, and the green Chaos Emerald flashed into existence in front of the portal. Metal stared in awe. There they both were. The single object Eggman ordered him to get, and the way home. And somewhere, deep in the most fundamental recesses of his motherboard, his most basic programming screamed through his processors. He was programmed to follow orders, and he had been ordered to find the Chaos Emerald. He had been ordered to return to Eggman's base. Eggman would be delighted. He would have the Emerald, and he would never see Sonic again. Metal lifted his hand towards the Chaos Emerald. He stared at it as the green prism reflected across his face. Slowly, his fingers closed around it, and he felt its smooth, powerful surface in his hand. Sonic went to shout, but E2048 moved its claw over his mouth, and the only sound he made was a muffled choke. I always knew you were reasonable, Paperweight. No hard feelings, Oh, and say hi to my dear counterpart on the other side. Metal stared at the gem in his hand, then looked up at the portal blazing through the air. He turned, watching as Sonic struggled in E2048's grasp. Metal Sonic only had one goal. He was built for only a single reason. Nothing else mattered, not even his other directives. Primary objective: neutralize Sonic the Hedgehog. Metal rushed forward, leaping past the portal, and threw himself onto E2048's chassis. He clawed all around, searching for the familiar gap where the exposed power cable would be. But there was no gap, for in its place, Metal only found a smooth panel. He felt E2048's claw strike against his chest, and Metal flew backwards, skidding across the floor with his forehead. With only one claw clasped around him, Sonic tore himself up and threw all his weight into a single kick. His foot struck E2048's other claw, and the robot's grip slipped further, but Sonic didn't relent. He spun up, flying forward in a spin dash, and his quill sliced through the center of E2048's chassis. The robot flew backwards, having lost its grip entirely, and crashed into a sparking heap. Before Metal even had a chance to stand up, Sonic was at his side. He threw his arms around Metal's chest and lifted him to his feet. Metal paused, looking Sonic in the eyes, and feeling his hands around his chest. I knew you wouldn't leave me, Sonic said, and he wrapped his arms around Metal again. This time, Metal finally knew what he was supposed to do. He wrapped his arms around Sonic's waist and buried his face in Sonic's shoulder. Of course I would not leave you. We're friends, are we not? And that makes you the single most important thing, Metal said. Why, you buggy, obsolete hunk of scrap! If that's how you want to play, so be it! Nika screeched over the radio, and with another click, the portal vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Metal didn't have time to respond. The particle accelerator began to hum. It was gradual at first, but the sound grew louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. Ahead, Metal saw steam flood the tunnel as E2048 flew down through the corridor and disappeared. Sonic threw himself under Metal, lifted him into his arms, and prepared to run down the corridor. He could only take a few steps before he had to skid to a halt as a slab of concrete rushed down from the ceiling and crashed into the pipe, completely blocking the tunnel. He turned to carry Metal the other way, but another slab collapsed there too, and there was no way out. They were trapped, with nowhere to go, and the humming only grew louder. The machine continued to screech, smoke beginning to rise from the seams, drifting like motes to the ceiling. Just as Metal thought the noise could grow no louder, the particle accelerator shuddered, and the smoke began to steam. "We're stuck, and it's gonna blow!" Sonic shouted. Metal looked down at the brilliant green gem, then thrust the Chaos Emerald into Sonic's hand. "Get us out of here!" Metal said. Sonic's eyes widened. He nodded. With his arms wrapped tightly around Metal, he directed the flow of energy from the emerald. The accelerator exploded, and they disappeared in a green flash.